In 216 BC, on a dusty plain in southern Italy, that is exactly what Rome walked into. By the end of the day at Cannae, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers would lie dead. A smaller, outnumbered army had swallowed a larger one whole. The commander was Hannibal Barca of Carthage, and the maneuver he executed that day is still studied as one of the most perfect tactical traps in military history. To understand Cannae, we have to understand how Rome and Carthage reached this point. The Second Punic War began over control of the western Mediterranean. Carthage, a wealthy trading power based in North Africa, had built a new empire in Spain after losing the First Punic War to Rome. Hannibal, son of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, grew up in those Spanish campaigns. Legend says that as a child he swore an oath of eternal hatred toward Rome. In 219 BC, he attacked the Roman-allied city of Saguntum in Spain. Rome demanded he be handed over for punishment. Carthage refused. War followed. Instead of waiting for the Romans to come to Spain, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He marched his army overland, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps, bringing war directly into Italy. The crossing cost him men, horses, and elephants, but those who survived were hardened and loyal. In his first battles on Italian soil, Hannibal proved he was no ordinary commander. At Trebia in 218 BC and Lake Trasimene in 217, he lured Roman armies into ambushes and destroyed them. Rome, shocked by the scale of these defeats, turned to a more cautious strategy under the dictator Fabius Maximus, shadowing Hannibal and avoiding pitched battles. But patience is hard for a proud republic that sees itself as destined to rule. By 216 BC, political pressure in Rome demanded a decisive victory. The Senate raised one of the largest armies it had ever fielded, perhaps 80,000 infantry and around 6,000 cavalry, drawn from Roman citizens and Italian allies. Two consuls shared command: Gaius Terentius Varro, more aggressive and politically driven, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, more cautious and experienced. They would alternate control of the army each day. Hannibal, meanwhile, had chosen his ground. Near the small town of Cannae in Apulia, a wide, flat plain stretched along the banks of the river Aufidus. The open terrain favored cavalry, and Hannibal's mounted troops were better and more numerous than Rome's. Summer winds there often blew dust into the faces of troops advancing from the west, exactly the direction the Romans would likely choose. Hannibal's army was smaller than the Roman force, perhaps 40 to 50,000 strong, but it was a balanced and battle-hardened mix. Heavy African infantry in good armor, Spanish and Gallic swordsmen, and powerful Numidian and Iberian cavalry. Crucially, his men trusted him completely. They had followed him for years through impossible campaigns. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, Varro held command and ordered the Romans out to fight. Confident in their numbers, they formed a massive block of heavy infantry in the center, much deeper than usual, flanked by smaller bodies of cavalry on each wing. The plan was straightforward: smash through Hannibal's center with sheer weight, break his line, and end the war in a single decisive blow. Hannibal arranged his troops very differently. In the center, he placed his Spanish and Gallic infantry in a slightly forward curving arc, like a shallow bulge toward the Romans. On either side of this center, he stationed his best African infantry in more rigid, disciplined formations. On the flanks, he massed his cavalry. heavy horse on one side under Hasdrubal, and nimble Numidians on the other. To many Roman observers, it looked as though Hannibal's center was weak and exposed, offering them exactly what they wanted, a target to crush. In reality, it was bait. The battle opened with skirmishers trading missiles, then the main lines collided. Roman legionaries pressed into Hannibal's central infantry, their deeper formation driving the Carthaginian and allied troops slowly backward. Dust filled the air, the sun and wind were in Rome's eyes. From ground level, it seemed the Romans were grinding their way toward victory. But as Hannibal's center gave ground, it did not break. Instead, it bent inward, changing from a bulge to a shallow U-shape that wrapped around the front edges of the Roman mass. At the same time, the African infantry on the flanks held firm, waiting. On the wings, the cavalry fight went differently. Hannibal's heavy cavalry quickly overwhelmed the Roman horse on one side, scattering or killing many of them. Rather than chase fleeing enemies too far, the Carthaginian riders regrouped and galloped behind the Roman infantry to help the Numidians drive off the allied cavalry on the other flank. With both Roman cavalry wings defeated, Hannibal now owned the open space behind Rome's army. Back at the center, the Romans crowded tighter as they pushed forward. There was no room to maneuver, little space even to swing a sword. Then Hannibal gave the signal. The African infantry on each side pivoted inward like closing doors, striking the Roman flanks. What had been a straight line of Carthaginian troops became a crescent around the packed Roman mass. Moments later, the victorious cavalry swept in from the rear. The trap snapped shut. For the Romans in the center, it was now too late to withdraw, too late to redeploy into a new formation. They were surrounded, front, sides, and rear, pressed together so tightly that those in the middle could hardly lift their weapons. Ancient sources describe the killing that followed as suffocating and relentless. Men died not only from wounds, but from heat, thirst, and the crush of bodies. We will never know the exact numbers, but many historians estimate that 50,000 to 70,000 Romans and allies were killed or captured in a single day. Among the dead were many magistrates, senators, and senior officers. Consul Paulus fell in the fighting. Varro escaped with a small group of cavalry, later returning to Rome expecting punishment, only to be thanked for not giving up entirely. Rome had suffered the worst defeat in its history. For Carthage and Hannibal, Cannae was a masterpiece. A smaller force had annihilated a larger one through planning, discipline, and the careful use of terrain and psychology. The double envelopment maneuver, surrounding an enemy on all sides, became a model of tactical brilliance. Yet even this perfect trap could not win the war on its own. After Cannae, many of Rome's Italian allies wavered, some defected to Hannibal. Southern cities opened their gates. Macedonia made an alliance with Carthage. It seemed possible that the Roman Republic might actually collapse. But Rome refused to negotiate. Instead of fielding another huge army for one more gamble, the Senate adopted something like Fabius's old cautious strategy on a national scale. They raised new legions, fortified the city, and avoided pitched battles with Hannibal whenever possible. They fought him indirectly, cutting his supply lines, recapturing defected cities, and slowly grinding down Carthage's resources overseas. Hannibal spent more than a decade campaigning in Italy, winning battles but unable to force Rome to surrender. Eventually, Roman armies carried the war back to Spain and North Africa. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal himself would be defeated by Scipio Africanus, a Roman commander who had studied his methods carefully. The Battle of Cannae remains, however, a turning point not only in that war, but in the history of warfare. Generals from Frederick the Great to Napoleon and beyond have admired the way Hannibal used a seemingly weak center, strong flanks, and superior cavalry to shape the enemy's decisions and then destroy them. For Rome, Cannae was a lesson paid for in blood. Numbers alone do not guarantee victory, and overconfidence can be fatal. For the rest of the world, it is a reminder of how a single day, a single battlefield, can show both the heights of military skill and the depths of human loss. On that plain near Cannae, the dust has long since settled. Fields now cover the ground where legions once stood shoulder to shoulder, believing their strength would carry the day. What remains is the pattern of the battle, Hannibal's perfect trap, and the story of how even Rome, at the height of its power, could walk straight into disaster.